It's easy to forget that satellites are a major part of our daily lives.
We all expect to open our mobile phone and look for a place where we want to go and find the directions to get there. We use satellite positioning technology. In the same way, when we go on a trip, we withdraw money at an ATM in America, and we obtain that money thanks to satellite telecommunications that connect with our bank in Europe.
It's hard to imagine life without smartphones, bank cards, or GPS systems.
Nowadays, we wouldn't live long without satellites.
Yet the proliferation of debris risks compromising today's constantly diversifying satellite services. So all space agencies have to take serious risks each time they launch, including the European Space Agency.
If we are waiting for a situation where our uncertainty volume is completely empty, that would mean we could never launch. So believe it or not, we are launching despite of the possibility of having conjunctions with objects, because otherwise there would never be a green light for launch.
The risk is now proven and even quantified.
The odds of losing a satellite are 5%. Part of it is the risk of being hit by debris. The other parts are simple. There is complicated hardware that can break, causing the satellite to be lost. But the likelihood of losing a satellite can quickly reach 10 or 20% with the increase in orbital debris.
The European Space Agency estimates that the risk of collision will rise to 20% by 2038. So 1 out of every 5 satellites would not complete its mission. It's a huge figure. Space agencies have had to look at ways of negotiating this minefield and detecting the circling waste. Since 1957, the United States has been using a space surveillance network to predict where and when orbital debris will enter the Earth's atmosphere. They have established a catalogue of the debris that is currently in orbit and use this to determine which country owns the debris that is entering the atmosphere. They can also warn NASA if debris is at risk of interfering with their satellites. Over time, as the number of artificial objects in orbit has multiplied, this system has been refined and computerized. But in Europe, a similar space surveillance system was not put in place until 40 years later. In 1996, when debris from the Ariane rocket damaged military satellite Cerise, the French Ministry of Defense created a system known as GRAVE.
The GRAVE system, a space surveillance network, is our main sensor that allows us to detect objects that orbit around 250 to 600 miles in altitude, as long as they are large enough to be detected by radar. In other words, if they are the size of a large washing machine.
To detect orbiting satellites up to 600 miles above France, even when it's cloudy, the system uses a particular radar that makes real-time calculations to follow and anticipate the trajectories of thousands of satellites. The GRAVE system was able to detect 30 or so Chinese and American spy satellites that had not been catalogued previously.
Today, international relations in space are a mixture and an extension of those on the ground. In other words, there is as much mutual aid as there is competition, or sometimes open confrontations.
France agreed to keep quiet about the spy satellites, but in return, they asked the Americans for access to their orbital debris catalogue. This catalogue is considerably more detailed than the European version, since the Americans can detect objects as small as 4 inches.
We deal with the problem of small objects by Franco-American cooperation that allows us to retrieve information even at the confidential level.
This constant space surveillance is efficient and allows civilian and military satellites to avoid collisions with orbital debris. If there is a risk, ground-based operators can move their satellites slightly out of their orbit. These maneuvers happen more and more often, particularly for the largest satellite of all time, the International Space Station. This inhabited satellite is threatened by debris several times a year. To avoid orbital debris with an identified trajectory, the space station has to be moved from its course. In 2012, it avoided a piece of debris from the collision between the Iridium and Cosmos satellites 3 years previously. In 2021, the space station was forced to slalom 5 times between flying junk. This constant threat has become part of the astronauts' daily lives.
The space station is on a collision course with a small piece of space junk, as we've heard from the ground. My watch is beeping as a warning. We have to take the ISS into a higher orbit. For this, we have to turn on the engines for 37 seconds. And that is actually the only time in which we can measure or feel any acceleration on board. Suddenly, we are no longer weightless, but we are pushed backwards by the engines of the space station. So, let's start now.
Sometimes the ballistic data about debris is imprecise, in which case no risks are taken, and the astronauts are told to evacuate the station urgently. They take refuge in the escape module, which can be separated from the station and could return the astronauts to Earth.
Have a visual of the target. We are backing up. So far, decent work. In 20 seconds.
But evacuation isn't necessary every time. Frequently, orbital debris is not detected if it is smaller than 4 inches.